The sound wasn't loud. It was a dry snap, like a dead branch breaking underfoot. But in the absolute silence of the parade ground, it echoed like a gunshot. Colonel Richard Thorne's roar of pain was what followed. It was a raw animal sound of pure shock that ripped through the dry Afghan air. And in that frozen moment, every one of the 282 soldiers standing at rigid attention knew their world had just changed forever. All because the colonel had tried to hit Captain Eva Rostova. The morning had begun like any other at Forward Operating Base Sentinel. The sun was a relentless, burning eye in a pale sky, bleaching the color from everything it touched. The dust hung in the air, a fine powder that coated throats and equipment alike. For the men and women of the 3rd Battalion, this battalion review was just another piece of Army theater, a dog and pony show for a visiting commander known for his old-school rigidity. They stood in perfect, stiflingly hot rows, a sea of digital camouflage and stoic faces. Captain Eva Rostova stood in the front rank, her posture as straight as the barrel of the M4 rifle slung across her chest. At 32, she had a quiet intensity that set her apart. Her file, had anyone cared to look beyond the surface, was impressive. 2 combat tours, a Bronze Star for valor earned not by charging a hill, but by holding a casualty collection point under mortar fire for 6 hours, and a reputation for a cool, analytical mind in the Tactical Operations Center. But today, under the gaze of Colonel Thorne, she knew she was not being seen as a soldier. She was a symbol, a problem. She could feel the weight of his stare long before he reached her position. He moved down the line with a slow, deliberate pace, a bull of a man whose uniform was starched into a weapon. His voice, a low baritone, carried easily across the formation as he found minor, petty faults with the soldiers to her left. A loose thread here, a scuff on a boot there. Each correction was a public demonstration of his power. Eva's mind, however, was not on the inspection. It was on the briefing from 48 hours prior. The dimly lit toque, the glowing maps, Thorne's finger jabbing at a compound near a village called Alingar. His intel, from a source he trusted implicitly, pointed to a high-value target. Eva, cross-referencing drone footage with signals intelligence from a joint task force, had seen the truth. The compound shared a wall with a schoolhouse. She had stood up, her voice calm but firm in the tense room. Sir, the imagery suggests a high probability of non-combatant presence, specifically children. I recommend we delay and retask the surveillance drone. Thorne's face had darkened. He had been overruled by the brigade commander after Eva quietly passed her evidence up the chain. The raid was canceled. She had saved dozens of innocent lives, but she had made a mortal enemy. She had stolen his glory and exposed his flawed judgment. Now he stopped in front of her. The air grew thick. The entire battalion seemed to hold its breath. His eyes, cold and flinty, scanned her from head to toe, looking for a flaw that did not exist. Her boots were mirrors. Her uniform was sharp. Her weapon was spotless. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon itself. Captain Rostova, he finally said, his voice deceptively quiet, a near whisper that still carried to the first few ranks. Sir, she responded, her gaze fixed on a distant mountain peak. He took a half-step closer, invading her personal space. The smell of his starch and cheap cologne was suffocating. Your boot, he declared, his voice rising so the entire formation could hear the lie. There's a scuff. A ripple of unease went through the nearby soldiers. They could all see the patent leather shine on her boots. This was not an inspection. This was a provocation. Eva's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sir, my boots were polished at 0400 as per regulation. There is no scuff. A dangerous flicker passed behind Thorne's eyes. She had not bowed. She had not accepted his false reality. He leaned in so close she could see the broken capillaries on his nose. His next words were a venomous whisper, meant for her alone. You think your pretty face and your daddy's name give you the right to undermine me? You are a disgrace to this uniform. You are nothing. The words were meant to break her, but they were just words. What happened next was not. His face, contorted with rage, was the last thing she saw before his hand came up. It was not a fist, but a rigid, open-palmed strike, the heavy West Point class ring on his finger aimed directly at her face. It was an act of pure, unadulterated fury, an assault from a man who believed he was a god among men. Time seemed to slow. A collective silent gasp froze in the throats of the 282 witnesses. This was the line that could never be crossed, and he had crossed it. The world did not slow down. It sharpened. Every detail burned itself into Eva's senses. The dust motes dancing in the harsh sunlight, the sharp, clean scent of gun oil from her rifle, the faint, panicked hitch in the breath of the private standing next to her, and the glint of that heavy gold ring on Colonel Thorne's hand as it arced toward her face. It was not a blur of motion, but a series of crystal-clear, terrible images. Training did not take over. Training was for the firing range and the obstacle course. This was something deeper, older. It was instinct, honed in a different kind of war, a silent war fought in the hallways of her childhood home. Her body moved before her mind could form a single coherent thought. She did not flinch away from the blow. She moved inward, closing the distance, her left forearm rising not to block, but to deflect, a fluid redirection of the force aimed at her. Her muscles remembered what her conscious mind had long tried to forget. Her right hand shot out, not as a fist, but as a precise locking tool. Her fingers wrapped around his wrist, finding the pressure points with an unerring accuracy she had learned as a girl. It was a move her father had drilled into her, a brutal lesson from a man who believed compassion was a weakness. He had forced her to practice Aikido for hours, not for self-defense, but to toughen her up, to burn the softness out of her. He would say, "A Rostov does not show pain. A Rostov endures." Now she was using his own harsh gift against a man who was just like him. She executed the kotegaeshi not with anger, but with a devastating surgical precision. It was a wrist lock that used the attacker's own momentum against them. She twisted his wrist, turning his arm into a lever. His own forward force became the engine of his destruction. There was no struggle, no contest of strength. It was physics. It was anatomy. It was inevitable. The sound was not loud, but it was horribly distinct. A dry, crisp snap that cut through the silence more effectively than any scream. It was the sound of Colonel Richard Thorne's radius bone breaking. His roar of pain was immediate, a guttural, shocked cry that tore from his throat. The fury in his eyes vanished, replaced first by disbelief, then by a wave of pure, white-hot agony. He stumbled back, clutching his grotesquely bent arm to his chest, his face as pale as the desert sand. The invincible colonel was suddenly, terribly, human and broken. Eva released his wrist the moment she felt the bone give way. She did not push him. She did not advance. She simply took one precise step back and snapped back to a position of attention, her hands now clenched at her sides, her chest heaving as she fought to control her breathing. Her face was a mask of stone, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared straight ahead, seeing nothing, seeing everything. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. It was a deafening, suffocating blanket thrown over 282 soldiers. No one moved. No one spoke. They were statues in the heat, their eyes wide with a shared, traumatic witness. They had seen a senior officer commit an unforgivable assault, and they had seen a junior officer defend herself with a level of controlled, brutal efficiency they had never imagined. The chain of command, the very foundation of their world, lay shattered on the ground between them. Colonel Thorne sank to his knees, cradling his arm, his shoulders shaking. The fight, the bluster, the pride, all of it was gone, leaving only a broken man. A senior medic, breaking from his stunned paralysis, rushed forward, his medical bag in hand. He knelt beside the colonel, his movements hurried and professional, but his eyes kept flicking toward Captain Rostova, filled with a mixture of awe and fear. Ava remained at attention. She could feel the weight of every single gaze upon her. She did not look at them. She looked through them. In her mind, she was not on a dusty parade ground in Afghanistan. She was in the cold, formal living room of her father's house, a 12-year-old girl picking herself up from the polished floor after a training session. She heard his voice, cold and disapproving. "Emotion is a liability, Ava. Control is everything." For the first time, she understood what he meant. The control it took not to hit back harder. The control it took not to scream. the control it took to simply stand there in the wreckage of her career and not fall apart. She had broken a man's arm, but she had not broken her discipline. And in the eyes of the soldiers watching, that made all the difference. The silence was a physical presence, thick and heavy in the desert heat. It was broken only by Colonel Thorne's ragged, pain-filled breaths and the frantic rustle of the medic's kit. Every soldier remained frozen, a gallery of statues witnessing a revolution. Their eyes were not on their broken commander, but on the woman who had broken him. Captain Eva Rostova stood immobile, her gaze locked on the distant horizon, her body rigid at attention. Inside, a storm raged. A single traitorous thought echoed. My career is over. The spell was shattered by the sound of boots crunching on gravel. Sergeant Major O'Malley, a man built like a brick wall with a face carved from granite, strode into the center of the scene. His eyes, sharp and missed nothing, took in the entire picture in a single, sweeping glance. The colonel on his knees, the medic, the captain standing like a marble sentinel. He did not look surprised. He looked resigned, as if he had been waiting for this particular explosion for a very long time. He stopped a few feet from Eva. He did not address her. Instead, his voice, a low rumble that carried absolute authority, cut through the tension. Battalion. At ease. The collective release of breath from 282 soldiers sounded like a gust of wind. They shifted their stances, but their attention remained riveted. O'Malley then turned his head slowly, his eyes scanning the formation. All right, the show's over. Senior leadership, front and center. The rest of you fall out. Return to your company areas now. The order was a relief. The formation dissolved into a controlled, hushed chaos. Soldiers turned, their steps hurried, but their heads craned for one last look. Whispers began to spread, a low hum of disbelief and speculation. They moved away in groups, casting glances back at the small, tense circle forming around their fallen commander and the captain who had struck the match. O'Malley finally turned to Eva. His expression was unreadable. Captain Rostova. His voice was flat, devoid of accusation, but also of comfort. It was the voice of procedure. You will accompany me to the command post, now! Eva's first movement was a slow, deliberate turn of her head. She met his gaze. Her eyes were dry, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. She gave a single sharp nod. Yes, Sergeant Major. As she took her first step to follow him, the world seemed to rush back in. The heat, the sound of a distant generator, the feel of her own sweat cooling on her skin. She walked past Colonel Thorne, who was now being helped to his feet by two other soldiers, his face ashen. He would not look at her. She felt no triumph, only a hollow, cold emptiness. She had done what was necessary, but the cost was a chasm opening at her feet. They walked in silence toward the low-slung building that housed the command post. The soldiers they passed stopped what they were doing, their conversations dying mid-sentence. They stared, their expressions a mixture of shock, curiosity, and in a few cases, a flicker of grim satisfaction. Eva kept her eyes forward, her posture perfect. She was a soldier walking to her own court-martial, and she would do so with her head high. Inside the command post, the air was cool and smelled of stale coffee and electronics. The junior officers and NCOs manning the stations fell silent as she and O'Malley entered. The sergeant major gestured toward a small, windowless office. In here, Captain, wait! She stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her, the sound as final as a coffin lid closing. She was alone. The room was sparse. A metal desk, 2 chairs, a blank whiteboard. She did not sit. She stood in the center of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, and finally allowed herself to tremble. She replayed the moment in her mind. The swing, the crack, the silence. She had been defending herself. That was the truth. But she had also humiliated a full-bird colonel in front of his entire command. The army had rules, but it also had an unspoken code, a politics of power, and she had just shattered it. She thought of her father, the retired general. What would he say? He would call her a fool for getting into the situation. He would call her weak for feeling anything about it at all. She closed her eyes, waiting for the axe to fall, wondering if the price for her moment of survival would be the end of everything she had worked for. The wait in the sterile office stretched on, each second a lifetime. Ava remained standing, her body rigid, her mind replaying the crack of the bone on an endless, torturous loop. She could still feel the impact, the sickening give of it, transmitted up her own arm. It was not a feeling of victory. It was the feeling of a line being crossed, a boundary she could never uncross. The door finally opened, but it was not Sergeant Major O'Malley. It was Captain James Mitchell, the battalion's JAG lawyer, his young face uncharacteristically grim. He carried a digital recorder and a notepad. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice soft. "I need to get your statement. Everything that happened out there." For the next hour she spoke. She kept her voice flat, emotionless, a pure recitation of facts. The inspection, the verbal provocations, the raised hand, the strike, her defensive reaction. She omitted nothing, not even Thorne's whispered insults. Mitchell listened, his pen scratching across the paper, his expression neutral. When she finished, he clicked off the recorder. "There were a lot of witnesses, Ava," he said, finally using her first name. "A lot. That counts for everything." He stood to leave, pausing at the door. "For what it's worth. My sister is in the Army. I'm glad you knew how to do that." The door closed, leaving her more alone than before. His words were a small, unexpected raft in a sea of uncertainty. It wasn't approval, but it was a recognition of her humanity. Later, the door opened again. This time, it was Command Sergeant Major O'Malley. He entered alone and closed the door quietly behind him. He didn't sit. He stood opposite her, his arms crossed, his gaze appraising. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. "He's been medevaced to Bagram," O'Malley said finally. "Compound fracture. He'll need surgery." Eva said nothing. She just waited. O'Malley's eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to look right through her. "I've been in this man's army for 28 years, he said, his voice a low rumble. "I've seen a lot of things. I saw a good man, a master sergeant, get busted down to private for striking a lieutenant who deserved it a whole hell of a lot more than Thorne did today. But that was 30 years ago. In a dark alley, with no witnesses." He paused, letting the weight of his experience fill the room. "What happened out there today? That wasn't in a dark alley. That was in the brightest sunlight imaginable, in front of God and everyone." He took a step closer. "The colonel has already called from the evac helicopter. He's demanding your court-martial. Assault on a superior officer. Conduct unbecoming. The whole book." Eva's heart sank like a stone. This was it, the end. But then O'Malley's stern expression shifted just slightly. A hard, determined light entered his eyes. "But he's not the only one with a phone. I've been on mine too. I've talked to every senior NCO in this battalion. We've been talking to our companies. To the privates, the specialists, the sergeants. The ones who saw what really happened." He leaned forward, his hands on the desk. "Captain, the Army runs on paper, but it lives and dies on the trust of its enlisted soldiers. And right now, Thorne doesn't have a shred of it left. And you—" He looked at her, a long measuring look. "You have 282 sworn statements to make. This isn't over." He turned and left the room, leaving Eva standing there, the cold emptiness inside her suddenly warmed by a single, fragile ember of hope. It was no longer just about her survival. It was about the truth. The next 48 hours were a strange, suspended reality. Eva was placed on a temporary administrative duty, confined to the base and stripped of her command responsibilities. It was a form of purgatory. The official investigation, led by a stern-faced colonel from brigade, was a whirlwind of interviews and evidence collection. Eva spent most of her time in her small, Spartan room, trying to read, trying to sleep, but mostly just waiting. The atmosphere on the FOB had changed. When she walked to the mess hall, the conversations would hush, then resume in lower tones. But the looks she received were not of accusation. They were looks of curiosity, of respect, and sometimes, from the younger female soldiers, something akin to awe. On the third morning, she was summoned back to the command post. The same windowless room. This time, Colonel Iverson from brigade was there, along with Sergeant Major O'Malley and Captain Mitchell. Iverson's face was unreadable, a mask of military impartiality. He gestured for her to sit. "Captain Rostova," he began, his voice crisp and formal. "The investigation into the incident on the parade ground is complete. We have taken statements from all 282 personnel present, as well as from Colonel Thorne at the combat hospital in Bagram. He opened a thick file on the desk. The evidence is overwhelming and unanimous. He looked up from the file, his eyes meeting hers. Colonel Thorne maintains that you instigated the confrontation and executed an unprovoked attack after he corrected your bearing. His account, however, is not supported by a single witness. Not one. The sworn testimony describes a consistent sequence of events: verbal provocation, a physical assault initiated by Colonel Thorne, and your use of defensive techniques to protect yourself. He closed the file. The JAG office at Brigade concurs. No charges will be filed against you, Captain. Your actions are deemed justified self-defense. The air left Eva's lungs in a slow, controlled exhale. She had not realized how tightly she had been holding herself together until that moment. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical weight being lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you, sir," she said, her voice remarkably steady. Colonel Iverson gave a curt nod. "Colonel Thorne has submitted his resignation for medical reasons. It has been accepted, effective immediately." He stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "You are reinstated to full duty, Captain. Your company has missed your leadership." As Iverson left, Captain Mitchell offered her a small, genuine smile before following him out. Sergeant Major O'Malley remained. He waited until the door was shut before he spoke. "It's done," he said, his voice low. "It's over." Eva looked at him, the full weight of what had happened finally settling upon her. "It wasn't just about me, was it, Sergeant Major?" O'Malley's stern face softened almost imperceptibly. "No, Captain, it wasn't. It was about every soldier who's ever been bullied by a bad leader. It was about every one of those 282 kids who saw that the system can actually work. They saw an injustice, they told the truth, and it mattered." He moved toward the door. "You're a good officer, Rostova. Don't let this make you hard. Let it make you wise." He left her alone in the quiet room. She sat there for a long time, not moving. She thought of the young private who had first gasped. She thought of the medic who had looked at her with awe. She thought of the hundreds of silent witnesses who had chosen to stand with the truth. She had gone into that confrontation utterly alone, but she had not been alone. They had been with her. They had saved her. The victory was not in the broken arm. The victory was in the unbroken solidarity of the soldiers she led. She finally stood up, straightened her uniform, and walked out of the room. She had a company to lead. The war was waiting. The walk from the command post to her company area was the longest of Eva's life. The sun felt different on her skin. The air tasted cleaner. She was a free woman, reinstated, vindicated. But as she approached the cluster of dusty tents and Humvees that housed her soldiers, a new kind of anxiety began to bloom. How would they look at her now? Would she be their captain, or would she forever be the woman who broke the colonel's arm? She saw a group of her soldiers, a mix of mechanics and infantrymen, gathered around the hood of a truck. As she drew nearer, their conversation died down. They turned to look at her. For a heart-stopping second, there was only silence. Then, Specialist Chen, a young woman with grease smeared on her cheek, slowly brought her hand up in a crisp salute. It was not the casual, routine salute of daily life on the FOB. It was sharp, deliberate, and held for a beat longer than necessary. The others followed suit, their postures straightening, their faces etched with a new, profound respect. Eva returned the salute, her throat tight. "As you were," she said, her voice thankfully steady. They relaxed, but the formal atmosphere remained. Sergeant Davis, a grizzled veteran with 3 tours under his belt, gave a short, sharp nod. "Good to have you back, ma'am." The simple statement meant more than any official clearance from Brigade. It was acceptance. It was belonging. She continued on, and everywhere she went, it was the same. A hushed pause, followed by a respectful nod, a quiet ma'am, or another deliberate salute. There were no cheers, no backslaps. This was not a celebration. It was an acknowledgement. They had seen the darkness a bad leader could bring, and they had seen it challenged. In her, they saw a standard upheld. Later that afternoon, she was in the company operations center, reviewing the patrol schedules she had missed, when a shadow fell across the doorway. She looked up to see Private First Class Miller, the youngest soldier in her company, the one who had been standing right next to her during the inspection. He looked pale and nervous, clutching his Kevlar helmet in front of him like a shield. "Private Miller," Eva said. "What can I do for you?" He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say something. I was there. I saw it all." He took a shaky breath. "He was going to hit you, ma'am." He really was. "And when you did what you did," he struggled for the words, his young face earnest. "My last unit back in Texas, there was a sergeant. He was like that. Always yelling, always putting his hands on people. Nobody ever did anything. We were all too scared." He looked down at his boots, then back up, meeting her eyes with a sudden, fierce courage. "I just wanted to say thank you, Captain, for not being scared." Eva felt a lump form in her throat. This boy, barely out of high school, had just given her a medal more valuable than the Bronze Star hanging in her footlocker. He wasn't thanking her for her tactical skill or her leadership in a firefight. He was thanking her for her courage in facing a different kind of enemy. The enemy within. "Thank you, Private," she said, her voice soft. "That means a great deal to me. Now get back to your duties." He beamed, snapping off a perfect salute before practically bouncing out of the room. Eva leaned back in her chair, the patrol schedule forgotten. She thought about Miller's words. For not being scared. But she had been terrified. She was still terrified. The fear had just been a fuel, not a brake. She looked around the ops center, at the maps on the walls, the radios crackling with status reports. This was her command. These were her soldiers. They had stood by her. They had trusted her. And in return, she had given them something perhaps they didn't even know they needed, the proof that integrity could win. The shadow of the colonel was gone, and in its place was something stronger, something forged in fire and silence. It was the respect of the people who mattered most. The weeks that followed were a return to the brutal, simple rhythm of war. Patrols went out and came back. Intelligence was gathered, analyzed, and acted upon. The dusty monotony of the FOB was punctuated by moments of sheer, heart-pounding terror during convoy operations outside the wire. Through it all, Eva led with a quiet confidence that had deepened since the incident. The whispered legend of the captain who broke the colonel's arm had solidified into a bedrock of unshakable trust. Her soldiers followed her not out of fear, but because they had seen the steel in her soul. They knew she would never ask them to do anything she wouldn't do, and they knew, unequivocally, that she would protect them from any enemy, foreign or domestic. One evening, as a brilliant orange sun bled into the Hindu Kush Mountains, Eva was in her quarters reviewing a map for the next day's mission. A soft knock came at her door. "Enter!" Sergeant Major O'Malley stepped inside, holding a sealed manila envelope. "Something came for you on the weekly resupply bird, Captain. Classified courier." His tone was neutral, but his eyes held a glint of something unreadable. Eva took the envelope. It was heavy, the paper thick and official. Her name was typed on the front, followed by her rank and unit. There was no return address. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. Was this it? Some delayed legal action from Thorne's allies? A quiet reprimand buried in her permanent file? She broke the seal with a thumb, her fingers feeling suddenly clumsy. Inside was a single sheet of high-quality stationery. The letterhead at the top made her breath catch. It was the emblem of the Department of the Army Office of the Inspector General. The message was brief and typed in a stark, formal font to Captain Eva Rostova. From Office of the Inspector General. Subject: Informal Commendation. This communication serves to acknowledge receipt of numerous unsolicited statements from the personnel of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry Regiment, regarding an incident occurring on 14th of May. The detailed and consistent accounts of your conduct, under extreme and unlawful duress, have been noted. While the circumstances preclude a formal award, your demonstration of profound moral and physical courage, and the clear respect you command from your subordinates, reflects exceptional credit upon yourself and is in keeping with the highest traditions of military service. It has been observed that the truest measure of leadership is found in the faith of those who follow. You have that faith. Continue to earn it. Signed, Major General John H. Cox. Inspector General Eva read the letter twice, then a third time. The words blurred slightly. There was no medal, no public ceremony, no official record. It was a whisper from the highest levels of the army, a secret handshake from the institution itself. It was recognition of a different kind, more powerful and more meaningful than any piece of ribboned metal could ever be. They knew. The people at the very top knew what had happened, and they approved. She looked up at Sergeant Major O'Malley. He was watching her, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth. "I took the liberty of making some calls to some old friends at the Pentagon," he said quietly. "Thought someone ought to know the whole story, not just the version certain people might try to write." Eva couldn't speak. She just held up the letter, her hand trembling slightly. This was the final piece of the ordeal falling into place. It wasn't just her battalion or her brigade that had stood with her. In its own quiet, bureaucratic way, the army itself had stood with her. It had looked at a messy, complicated, and deeply embarrassing situation and had seen the truth. They had seen a leader. She had not just survived. She had been affirmed. O'Malley turned to leave, pausing at the door. "That's for you, Captain. Not for your file. For you." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Eva sat alone in the growing dusk, the official paper feeling weighty in her hands. She thought of her father, the general. He had always measured success in medals and promotions. What would he think of this classified letter, this secret praise? She realized with a sudden, startling clarity that she didn't care. This was her victory, defined on her own terms. It was written not in citations, but in the loyalty of her soldiers and this silent, powerful nod from the institution she had sworn to serve. The war outside continued, but the war within her was finally, truly over. The end of her tour came not with a bang, but with the dull roar of a C-17's engines. The giant transport plane was a metal whale, swallowing Eva and the rest of the rotation's soldiers whole, carrying them away from the dust and danger of Afghanistan and toward the familiar green of home. The flight was a liminal space, a bubble of noise and fatigue suspended between two worlds. Some soldiers slept, others stared blankly at the bulkhead, their minds still half in the mountains. Eva sat upright. The general's letter, now creased and soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times, secure in her chest pocket. It was her touchstone, a quiet truth against the roaring uncertainty of what came next. The landing was jarring, a hard return to gravity and reality. As they filed off the plane onto the tarmac of Fort Benning, the Georgia humidity was a thick, wet blanket after the arid Afghan air. And then she saw them. The families. A sea of handmade signs, waving flags, and faces filled with a desperate, joyful hope. The air crackled with the energy of 1,000 long-awaited reunions. Soldiers broke from the formation, running into the arms of spouses, sweeping children into the air, collapsing into the embraces of weeping parents. It was a symphony of love and relief, and for a moment Eva felt like a ghost, invisible amidst the celebration. She had no one there. Her father believed such displays were beneath a soldier. Her mother was long gone. She stood alone with her duffel bag, an island in a swirling, happy sea. She began the long, solitary walk toward the processing center, the sounds of happy families fading behind her. It was then that she heard it. Not a shout, but a sound she knew as well as her own heartbeat. The sound of hundreds of pairs of boots snapping together, coming to attention. She stopped and turned. They were all there. Not the whole battalion, but a formation of nearly 100 soldiers from her company. They had not gone to their families first. They had formed up in perfect silent ranks on the tarmac, their families watching from a respectful distance. They were in clean uniforms, their backs straight, their eyes fixed on her. Sergeant Major O'Malley stood at their front. He took one step forward. "Company!" His voice, that familiar gravelly boom, cut through the humid air. "Atten Hut!" The sound of 100 boots clicking together was a single sharp report. It was a sound that demanded silence, and it got it. The celebrating families quieted, turning to watch the unexpected ceremony. O'Malley turned to face Eva. His face was stern, but his eyes shone with a fierce, paternal pride. "Captain Rostova," he said, his voice carrying to every ear, on behalf of the men and women of Charlie Company, and on behalf of every soldier who had your back. Welcome home." He took another step forward, and in his hands was not a medal, but a simple, folded American flag. It was not a new, pristine flag. It was the flag that had flown over the command post at FOB Sentinel. Its edges were frayed, and it was stained with the dust of Afghanistan. It had witnessed everything. "Ma'am," O'Malley said, his voice dropping, becoming intensely personal. "We don't have a medal for what you did. But we have this. This flag saw the truth. It saw our captain stand for us. So we brought it home for you." He held it out to her. Ava's composure, which had held through the assault, the investigation, the fear, finally broke. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness, but of an overwhelming, profound gratitude. She accepted the flag, its weight feeling immense, sacred. It was heavier than any award. It was the weight of their trust, their loyalty, their shared sacrifice. She could not speak. She simply held the flag to her chest and looked out at the faces of her soldiers. She saw PFC Miller grinning from ear to ear. She saw Specialist Chen standing tall and proud. She saw Sergeant Davis giving her that same solemn nod. They had given her a family. They had given her a home. She had gone to war a soldier seeking to prove herself, and she had returned a leader, recognized not by a general, but by the only people whose opinion would ever truly matter. The war was over. She was home,